entitled The Mandanas Ruling, Its Implications and Effects on the Role of Local Government in National Development. This forum is hosted by PAASE Research Expertise Cluster 13. This is Social, Economic, and Political Sciences Cluster. I am Sarah Daway Ducanes, Associate Professor of the University of the Philippines School of Economics and co-chair of PAASE Rec 13. With me is PAASE Rec 13 co-chair Dr. Rosalie Arcala Hall, Professor of Political Science in the Social Sciences Division of the UP Visayas. Now, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the PAASE board officers led by President Dr. Mariana Santo Domingo and the PAASE Foundation Philippines Incorporated President Dr. Gisela Concepcion. Okay, so we are in for an exciting forum this morning. We are privileged to have with us a distinguished panel of speakers or experts on the mentioned topic. Our main speaker is Dr. Charlotte Justine Jokno-Sikat, Research Fellow at the Philippine Institute for Development Studies and President of the Philippine Economic Society for 2022. She has a PhD in Business Administration, PhD in Economics Candidacy, an MS Management, and MA Business Administration, or MA Economics, all from UP Diliman. Her academic and professional experience has focused on public sector economics and political economy. As a former professor at UP Diliman, she taught courses on public sector and development economics and fiscal and monetary policy. She is also an international consultant in areas of public expenditures and financial management at national and local government levels. Now we have two reactors. Our first reactor is Dr. Dante B. Canlas, Professor Emeritus at the University of the Philippines School of Economics. He received his BS Mathematics and PhD in Economics at UP. He has written more than 70 papers in macroeconomics, money, and labor. He has held visiting appointments at Princeton University, Northern Illinois University, and Institute of Development Economies in Tokyo. He served as president of the Philippine Economic Society and in the cabinet of the Philippine government, was formerly the Secretary of Socio-Economic Planning. He has done consultancy work with the developing agencies like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and the United Nations Development Program. Now, our second reactor is Dr. Ronald U. Mendoza, Dean and Professor of Economics at the Ateneo School of Government. Dr. Mendoza is a governance and institutional reforms specialist with over 25 years of experience in development policy and public administration reforms. His work has appeared in various peer-reviewed economics and policy journals, and he has also published several books on international development, public finance, and international cooperation. He is a recipient of various awards, including the 2012 National Academy of Science and Technology's 10 Outstanding Young Scientists in the Philippines, and the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders in 2013. In early 2022, he was listed among the top scientists in the AD Scientific Index 2022 based on the total number of citations in the last 5 years, ranking 51st in the top 1,000 Philippine scientists and second in the economics or econometrics category. He obtained his bachelor's degree in economics in the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines, or from Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines, his master's in public administration and international development from the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and his MA and PhD in economics from Fordham University. Now, this forum will have two parts and a Q&A portion at the end. Part one, Dr. Jokno-Sikat will have 20 minutes to present the basics of economic theory on decentralization and the Philippine experience thus far. Her presentation will then be followed by the reactions of Dr. Canlas and Dr. Mendoza, who will each have 5 minutes. Part 2, Dr. Jokno Sikat will again have 20 minutes to discuss specific issues and how to move forward with the implementation of the Mandanas Garcia Supreme Court ruling. Her presentation will again be followed by 5-minute reactions by Dr. Canlas and Dr. Mendoza. The remaining 30 to 35 minutes will be allotted for Q&A. Now, you may place your questions in the chat box below or orally air them during the Q&A portion. Now, my co-chair, Professor Rosalie Hall, will be moderating the forum proper. Without further ado, please welcome with me Dr. Charlotte Justine Jokno Sikat.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much, PAASE, for this interest. As I mentioned earlier, if you were able to chime in, Giselle actually emailed me and asked me to share our studies and my perspective on the implementation of the Mandanas Garcia Supreme Court ruling. And I hope that I'm able to cover all of that, the long list that was requested for by Gisela. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Now, I'd just like to make sure that everyone can see my screen. Is this okay, Sarah?
Yes, Justin.
Okay, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank, apart from the moderators, Sarah and Rosalie, I'd also like to thank the discussants for taking their time as well, to look at the as I said, specially curated presentation. So let me share with you, okay, the implications of the Mandanas Garcia Supreme Court ruling and the role of local governments in national development as I see it. Now, this year, we all know that there are major shifts in governance. There's a new president, administration, national and locally elected officials. But at the same time, we're still managing the now endemic COVID-19 and recovering from the economic contraction of 9.5% in 2020 with recovery of 5.3% in 2021. So here we see just the trend line of the GDP growth rate. But at the same time, fiscal policymakers are also have also been preparing actually for the past couple of years for the implementation of the redevolution, as for lack of a better term, of the Mandanas Garcia Supreme Court ruling. Now, what are the questions that I hope to answer today? What is the Mandanas ruling? What are its implications? And how can LGUs be partners in national development? And I will answer this in two parts, as Sarah mentioned earlier. I'll first be presenting the Philippine decentralization and principles behind decentralization, and also sharing the recent evidence we have on our studies at the Philippine Institute for Development Studies regarding focus primarily on LGU development planning and budgeting, which is where much of my focus has been there since I was seconded in 2019 from UP, and now I've permanently moved already to the PIDS. So it's a compilation of our different studies. We're mostly academics here, so it's like my compre thus far. So that's what I'll be sharing with you today. Now, before I go into the details, particularly of the Mandanas ruling, the Mandanas Garcia Supreme Court ruling, basically the most simple way to understand it is just that it broadened the revenue base of the national government on which to compute the intergovernmental fiscal transfers that will be allotted to local government units. So that's basically it. And I'll be discussing the formula, how it looks like later on. So they are now entitled to a larger portion of national government revenues. And what is the concern with that? The concern of fiscal policymakers, in a nutshell, really is how to implement this increase in revenues. So there was about a 38% increase in allocations to local governments this year from the national budget. So this reduced this caused a reduction in fiscal space from the point of view of the national government, less money to spend because it will now be given to local governments. It's their entitlement by law. So that's the primary concern. So the past couple of years, fiscal policymakers have actually been trying to gear up towards this, and most of the focus is actually really in strengthening the capacity of local governments to develop, to draft development plans. I'll show you evidence that a lot of them have been outdated until 2020, and also to implement. Even beyond planning, we know that what's more important, what gets you there is the implementation. So for the first part, Philippine decentralization and economic principles. Now, The Philippine government in 1991 instituted decentralization with the policy to transform LGUs into self-reliant communities and active partners in the attainment of national goals through a more responsive and accountable local government structure. Now we have it's simply like this. So we have a unitary form of government because we still have, in the constitution, it's still unitary form. We have the Republic of the Philippines. So that's the national government. Now there are local government units within regions, 17 regions of the Philippines. And within the 17 regions, there are about 81 provinces, 146 cities, and 1,488 municipalities. And of this, there are 42,046 barangays. Now, good morning to those here in Manila. So I just try to share as simply as possible the basic principles of decentralization and how they are related, rather than being a lecture on public finance, how they are related actually to the implementation of the devolution of expenditures or the assignment of expenditures and revenues to local governments. How are these done in principle? So the basic overarching principle behind decentralization in the public finance literature really is that your local chief executives know what you need and what their constituents want better than, let's say, any central government. So I remember the stories. Well, I was already alive then, and I think some of us here were already alive then, when we didn't have a decentralized form of government before 1991. If a mayor, let's say, in a town in Lanao, wanted to request a typewriter, he had to travel all the way to Manila in order to request it. And back then, there was no Cebu Pacific. There were no frequent flights. There was only the PAL. It was very costly to travel all the way to Manila, and of course you couldn't go just take a day trip. You'd have to stay overnight. There'd need big accommodations just to request a typewriter. So that's the simplest way that you can perceive why decentralization is imagined to be more efficient, because the cost, what we call in economics transactions cost of actually purchasing the typewriter, is a lot. It's a waste of money. It could have been used also to provide more goods and services at the local government. So that's the basic moving principle behind decentralization. So we would attribute this to, let's say, Thibault, if you want to look at the literature, 1956, and also Wallace Oates of 1972. So those are the seminal articles on decentralization, the decentralization literature, or federalism literature also, because basically it's the same. The principles behind assigning expenditures and revenues and transfers, it's the same for decentralization. It's the same under federalism. The only thing is that with federalism, it's in your constitution. Us, we instituted it through a law, the Local Government Code of the Philippines. So having said all that, let's take a look at the basic principles behind assigning, let's say, expenditures to local government units. First, it enhances efficiency and accountability. So that's the story of my typewriter. I hope all of you know what typewriters are, but that's the story of the typewriter. And accountability, it's supposed to be, it's supposed to improve accountability because the mayor is closer to you rather than, let's say, a national government official who's far away in Metro Manila. So you can easily replace, in theory, the mayor through elections, which we have every 3 years. Now, also, in assigning expenditure responsibilities, it must also be considered that there are what you call spillover effects for certain functions that could be assigned to local government. So what are spillover effects? In economics, we call this externalities. It's when the action of one agent unintentionally affects the action of another agent. So the basic, the mainstream example for this would be pollution, right? If you have a steel producing firm and it emits carbon monoxide or toxic wastes, and it's not treated properly, let's say it's dumped into the river, so it affects those downstream the river, those who are located near it. So that's what you call an externality, and you'd like that steel producing firm should take account of that, and consider that impact and control the emissions, control the dumping of toxic waste. But I know Ron here is more of an expert in, I think, the blue economy, if I'm not mistaken. But in any case, when you look at spillover effects, there are certain goods and services that are assigned locally, but might actually be better provided by either a higher level of government or through cooperation across LGUs. And Professor Hall here has written, I mentioned earlier, she's written a couple of articles on local water supply, and I myself also did. And for example, local water supply, that would be a perfect example because it's costly to put up a water supply system or a water district. So it might be beneficial for it to be provided by neighboring local government units. There could be inter-LGU cooperation, or it could be provided by a higher level of government. Let's say if it's a municipality, so it would be the city, or well, if it's a component city, or it could be the province. So that's what is meant by you have to consider spillover effects when you're assigning responsibilities. Now, there are also economies of scale, administrative and compliance costs. So when we talk about economies of scale, it's just like I mentioned earlier, it might be more beneficial for LGUs to provide a utility or a service that is has initially large sunk costs. So malaki po ang investment. I'm sorry, the Filipino. There are large investments entailed in providing this particular service. So it might be beneficial for higher level of government or across LGUs to provide this service. Now, also, finally, redistribution and equity. This is also a consideration. So the first three expenditure items here actually deal with the role of government, which looks at market failure. So there are three roles of government generally in account. So it's to address a market failure. So examples of those would be externalities. So that would provide a role of government. And second would be to redistribute income. So this would be more for equity or for fairness. So this would be the social protection programs and such. Now we know that the national government provides the 4Ps, which is a large social protection program nationally, but local governments also have their own version of this. Now, the DSWD, well, as of my last interaction with them, will still be maintaining, let's say with the Mandanas ruling, they'll still be maintaining the implementation of the 4Ps. But for other programs such as the assistance to individuals in crisis situations, they will already be redevolving this, and I'll speak about this later on. So as for the revenue side, the principles are also very simple. First, the policymakers have to consider factor mobility when we're talking about the assignment of revenues, because in the local government code of the Philippines, local governments also are given increased taxing powers. But when we talk about factors here, our term in economics really would be, the factors of production. So this would be, let's say, the land, labor, and capital, those inputs that you use to produce output. So the basic tenet is that if it's less mobile, the factor is less mobile, such as land and real estate, real property, you assign it to the local government because it cannot escape the tax by moving to another local government. So that's factor mobility for you, which is why I'll show you also the trend lines. For most of the past 30 years of the local government code of the Philippines, real property taxes actually was the main source. But in recent years, well, pre-pandemic, business taxes have caught up to become the largest source of property of local income for local government units. But there was this train three package, which I hope to be passed and I hope will be adopted by this moving forward and passed in Congress, which actually simplifies the real property valuation. As we'll see later on, it hasn't brought in the revenues that it should have, or theoretically, ideally should have. Now, also for revenues, we have to consider administrative and compliance costs, and then redistribution and equity as well. Now, just to note, the personal and the corporate income taxes still are with the national government, with the BIR, but there are local business taxes which are allowed for, and user fees as well for local governments to charge. Now, having said that, and we'll be discussing this later, in practice, and it's not unique to the Philippines. In practice, oftentimes the expenditures that are assigned to local governments actually would cost more than what local governments could raise. So in this case, the literature also suggests that there could be intergovernmental fiscal transfers, which is what I mentioned earlier that was affected by the Mandanas Garcia Supreme Court ruling, its computation. Now, I just presented two more common principles behind or justifications for the design of fiscal transfers. No? The first is that if there's a fiscal gap, which is exactly what I mentioned earlier, if their expenditures exceed revenues, then any government could opt to perhaps provide an intergovernmental fiscal transfer. There could also be fiscal imbalance, meaning that there are poorer local governments and there are richer ones. So perhaps there could be certain programs that prioritize the poorer local government units, and that is supposedly in the national budget for this year, the thrust, the focus, and even in the laws that have implications on local governments, the thrust would be for the poorer local government units. As we have first to sixth income class, the first being the richest and the sixth being the poorest. So the let's say one of the major what do you call this, national government support programs in the national budget that should assist LGUs is called the Growth Equity Fund, and it's supposedly supposed to prioritize poorer LGUs from the fifth, sixth income class municipalities. Now, the grants that could be given are actually could be conditional or could be unconditional. So, what are the unconditional grants? This is basically our intergovernmental fiscal transfer. It's called Internal Revenue Allotment or IRA, but now it's called National Tax Allotment or NATA. I always get corrected on that. I've been doing a lot of work on this for a long time, but it's called NATA now, so it's NATA. So basically, it's unconditional except for the mandate that 20% of it must be allocated to what we call the Local Development Fund. And I'll be talking about this later on. The Local Development Fund is actually the main source of infrastructure spending of local government units. And one of our studies showed, well, actually we cited COA reports, that this is actually underutilized. A World Bank report said that local governments only comply with it on the average about 50+% of the time. So that means that they only spent about 58% of the mandated local development fund that they should spend. So this has implications on delayed development. When you delay spending, this delays, the possible multiplier effects of government spending in any economy, local or national, albeit. So there are also conditional grants. Okay, one of the most common conditional grant that we can see is here is what we call it's not Performance Challenge Fund anymore. I have an article on this also in the Philippine Journal of Development. So the Performance Challenge Fund is actually a conditional grant based on two conditions for local governments. Okay, so for governments to be entitled to this, they must get the seal of good local governance, which is issued by the DILG every year. So there's a long list of requirements with respect to governance that is perceived to be the ideal or what the DILG would like, to LGUs to implement. So that would be the SGLG. Once any LGU gets that award, they are entitled to what you call the Performance Challenge Fund. And this Performance Challenge Fund will actually could be used for primarily infrastructure programs. So having said all that, this shows you the Section 17 of the Local Government Code of the Philippines, which will be the main focus actually of policymakers right now, as we are transitioning with the Mandanas ruling. So the reason it's called redevolution, because back in 2017, these functions were already assigned to local government. So under economic services, we have agricultural extension, community-based forestry projects, tourism, public works, infrastructure funded out of local funds, telecommunication services for provinces and cities. For social services, we have the school building program. Education was not devolved. Education is still centrally provided by the national government. We have field health and hospital services, social welfare services, housing projects for provinces and cities, such as low-cost housing, and then other services such as investment support and industrial research and development. So here, perhaps S&T can figure in later on, but we'll talk about that for the second part of this presentation. Now, if you can see here, the items that were devolved actually really, the principle is that if it benefits the locality, then it should be provided by the local government. If you can clearly identify who benefits and who is paying for it through their taxes. So let's say street lighting, clearly it's the local government that should provide it. And I have another paper with a long list of, the classifications typically adopted by the World Bank and, in the assignment of these different functions. So that's how this was designed. But as I said earlier, until this year, still some of these functions are still provided for through national government programs. So what I mean by this, the national government programs in their budget, in the national budget, still include provisions that would help support local governments in some of these functions. Okay, so it wasn't fully devolved, which is why it's called redevolution. So I also have another discussion paper on that, looking at, trying to estimate the three primary agencies and the cost of, how much it will cost, how much will be taken away from local governments in the form of national government, local government support programs. Now, this one takes a look at, the distribution of the national tax allotment, which is called the NATA now. So the total NATA for any fiscal year, so this is in the Local Government Code of the Philippines, is 40% of the national internal tax collection of the third preceding fiscal year. So for example, in 2022, what was used to compute the transfers to local governments was the revenue collections of the national government back in 2019. But the difference now with the Mandanas ruling is that prior to 2022, the computation of that total chunk of national government revenues was based only on the Bureau of Internal Revenue Collections. Now it was broadened. So the Bureau of Internal Revenue Collections plus the Bureau of Customs Collections, that total 40% of that should be given to all local governments in the third succeeding fiscal year. So that's how it's roughly estimated. Now that allocation is distributed as follows. So 23% of that 40% goes to provinces, 23% goes to cities, 34% goes to municipalities, and 20% goes to barangays. And then across the different levels of local governments, it's also distributed. There's a formula there. And the distribution is in the bottom part of the slide now. The allocation formula for each level of LGU is that it considers 50% the weight for population, 25% for land area, and 25% for equal sharing. Now, what is equal sharing? It would be 1 over the total number of local governments in your level of local government. So your peers, for example, in the case of municipalities, although we exclude BARM because they have a totally different, no? I said earlier it was 1466, no? But now it's excluding BARM, it's 1373. Okay, so for the cities, it's 1146. That's the M, that's the divisor. And that's why we also have another paper that looks at, the viability of LGUs. We looked at the income requirements because there are a lot of municipalities who want to become cities, but who don't actually have the capacity or the revenue sources of cities. I'll be showing you in the next slide here that they are heavily dependent, local governments are heavily dependent on the transfers they receive from the national government. So the sources of LGU income, so there are local source revenues. So this would be tax revenue. So this is real property tax on assessed value of real property, 1% for cities, 2% for LGUs in Metro Manila. There's also, they can charge, they have to charge also a special education fund, which is a piggyback. It's on top of real property taxes and idle lands. Now the chain 3 package that I'm an advocate for is actually addressing this assessed value of real property, because a lot of so LGUs, right? They have a list of, it's called the schedule of market values, on which there is the basis of their computation of the real property tax. Now, as of my last looking, well, I looked at it back in 2020, the average age of city schedule of market values was about 8 years old, and the average age of provinces was about 10 years old, which means that the base on which they compute real property taxes is outdated. It no longer represents the market prices. So the train 3 package actually, perhaps it's not going to be train 3 anymore, but the real property valuation reform actually simplifies this and actually removes from the local governments the approval. They will estimate it, they will propose it, but it will now be back at the central government to approve it, because it's a very political thing. Local chief executives do not want to update their schedule of market values because it's unpopular. It's unpopular. It would be difficult for them to get reelected. So I'm a very strong advocate of this. So they remove that political decision of approval, but it's still the local governments who have the autonomy to propose what the schedule of market values would be. Now, the non-tax revenues, the business tax, they're allowed to charge this, income from economic enterprises, and service and user fees. Now, what are the external sources of LGU income? These are intergovernmental fiscal transfers, share in proceeds from national wealth, and share in the proceeds of GOCCs from national wealth. Now here, this is just, showing you, so this is provincial income distribution, municipal income distribution, and city income distribution. So cities raise more local revenues, even enough to finance their own expenditures. Okay, but for provinces and municipalities, this is not the case. They are really heavily dependent. So how do we read these graphs now? If you look at the columns here, let's say for provinces and cities, this shows you the distribution. What is the proportion of local government income that is from local sources, and what is the proportion from external sources? So in the case of provinces, I'm sorry, I don't have my pointer here. In the case of provinces here, you see that the orange represents external sources. So provinces are heavily dependent on external sources, primarily the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. Now the trend line here shows you the non-tax revenues, the tax revenues, as well as internal revenue allotment. So the top trend line here, the one that's marked with a star, I don't know if you can see it, but this one here is actually the proportion of internal revenue allotments to external sources. So it's share. So it's really, provinces are heavily dependent. The same is the case for municipalities. They are heavily dependent. In this case, it's the gray bar that represents the external, and the top trend line here still is the proportion of internal revenue allotment. Now, national tax allotment, sorry about that. And then for cities, however, it's a different story. It's the local sources, which is the blue bar, the blue columns, which is their primary source of income. And you see the trend lines here. The orange one represents the tax revenue. So really, they are able to collect a lot of taxes, mostly business, I would presume, because we know there's more development in the cities compared. So this is just a summary of provinces, cities, and municipalities. So the trend is still the same. It's still more primarily external sources, which averages about 67% for the past decade. Now, in case of, so what did we spend on? So here we see that general public services gets the largest share of provinces of spending. However, provinces spend more on social services, while municipalities and cities spend more on capital outlays. Apparently, it seems to be. But I will argue that it's still not enough, especially moving forward with the Mandanas Garcia Supreme Court ruling. So here we have public expenditure distribution. The top post line would be general public services. So we have general public services, social services, economic services, and capital investment expenditures. And it's very important to discuss capital investment expenditures because a colleague of mine at PIDS, former professor at UP, Maggie de Buque Gonzalez, she just recently published an article that showed that the fiscal multipliers, or the impact of generating new income at the regional level, really is the largest for capital outlay spending at the regions. So this is the way to go. This is how we need to go moving forward in order to spur local economic development. So municipal expenditure distribution, it's the same also, general public services, and even for cities. Okay, now just to briefly mention, the local government code provides a cap for what could be allocated to personal services or to salaries. Okay, for poorer municipalities, LGUs, it's 55% of the budget. For richer ones, which is the first to the third, it's 45%. So which is why you really see it's mostly the cost of operating the bureaucracy that local governments spend on. Now, just to show you as a share of GDP, LGU expenditures and revenues are very small. It contributes very little. Expenditures is the top, the higher line, the one on top. It averages about 4%, or about 4% of GDP in the past decade. That's its contribution to the economy. For revenues, it's even less because we know they're heavily dependent on transfers. So it's about 3.5%. Now, just to show national government expenditures, on the other hand, have been averaged about less than 20%. So I think this is about 18.5% on average, or actually 17%. It only surged in recent years because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so in terms of expenditure distribution for the Philippines, actually, I think we can skip this. We can just focus on, I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to show, let's say perhaps the national government, okay, so this is the expenditure trend since 1983 now. So ever since 1995, they've been spending the largest proportion of the budget, or the largest share of the national budget has been going to social services. Okay, economic services has had the second largest share since 2007. So that's this trend line. And this was followed by general public services and defense. But the thing is, if you can see here now, there was an uptick in the later years. When we look at I have another DP on this, but when you look at the distribution across social services, this would be health, education, social security, and all that. The two sectors that get the largest share would be subsidy to LGUs in recent, because of the Mandanas ruling, subsidy to LGUs, and social protection, social services, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what are the budgetary implications? Well, I'll skip this because I'll be discussing this in the next part. So thank you so much. I'm sorry I went over time already. So thank you.
Sarah? Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. I will take over. So we now listen to the comments by Dr. Canlas and Dr. Mendoza. So Dr. Canlas will go first. Okay, wait, there is a comment here. Dr. Canlas? Oh, I think Dr. Canlas is using I was told that he is using the iPad of Susan, and I've already made that co-host. Okay. Thank you, Justin. I'm not sure if Dr. Canlas is able to connect, but
Yes, Prof. Rosalie is here.
okay, very good. Yes.
I just unmuted. So is it okay now?
Yes, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Would you like to also start your video?
Good morning, sir.
Okay, good morning, Dr. Justin. Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this forum on decentralization with Dr. Justin Jokno-Sikat's presenting the paper on decentralization. Okay, I prepared a three-pager. Should I continue to read it all in 5 minutes, or do I have to break it up because Justin is coming back to present her part 2? Hello?
Yes, she'll be presenting part 2.
So, shall I break up my discussion then into two parts
please.
also? Okay,
Part
thank
2
you.
should...
I just read from it, so I've had difficulties entering the Zoom meeting earlier, but good thing I was able to do it. Anyway, let me start by discussion by saying that Dr. Justin Jokno-Sikat's presentation gathers in one place important aspects of decentralization in the Philippine government. The centralization or devolution of some government services is widely accepted today. The legal framework for decentralization is Republic Act number 7160, popularly referred to as the Local Government Code or LGC of 1991. Implementation involves a formula involving internal revenue allotments and LGU share, as explained earlier by Dr. Sikat. Jokno-Sikat is 40% of national taxes of the preceding 3 years, collected by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Governors Hermilando Mandanas of Batangas and Enrique Garcia Jr. of Bataan petitioned the Supreme Court that the base for this taxes to be devolved be all national taxes. Following the enactment of the Local Government Code, many activities of the national government have been devolved to local government units, including public health, agricultural extension, and social welfare. And in support of the evolution, the national government grants LGUs the internal revenue allotments in addition to the taxes that LGUs are authorized to collect by law, such as real estate taxes as well as some local business taxes. Recently, the Supreme Court of the Philippines favorably approved a petition brought to it by Mandanas and Garcia to broaden the base for the IRA to include duties and other border taxes collected by the Bureau of Customs. Subsequently, important concerns posed by the favorable decision of the Supreme Court on the Mandanas-Garcia petition have emerged. My discussion, part one of my discussion of Dr. Jokno Sikat's presentation, simply reiterates key arguments for decentralization with the end in view of overcoming potential difficulties posed by the Supreme Court decision and preserve the gains made under decentralization so far. So let me break it at once to the readers. I'm in support of decentralization, but I know it's not fully completed at this point, and several challenges emerge every so often. One of them is this Mandanas favorable decision of the Supreme Court on the Mandanas-Garcia petition. Okay, to begin with, in a market-oriented economy, market agents rely greatly on the ability of markets to coordinate a variety of interrelated business and economic activities. For some reasons, however, markets may fail or unable to provide allocations commensurate to the total needs of society. Collective actions are thus needed to correct either market failures or limitations. When the economy is at an early stage of development, the government is often asked to provide the collective actions through tax and spending schemes. The government, however, does not have a monopoly over collective actions. As the economy develops, non-governmental organizations or NGOs may do just as well in correcting market failures and limitations, provided NGOs are able to exhibit comparative advantage in delivering public goods. In the delivery of public goods by government, a major consideration is efficiency. In this regard, a large body of work, both theoretical and empirical, and Dr. Justine has contributed to this large body of knowledge, has shown that some public goods are better delivered by LGUs than by national government agencies. At least two reasons exist for this. One, LGUs understand better the needs of their constituents and are in a position to respond in a timely manner to those needs. Two, influence costs, so-called, are reduced under decentralization. Local government executives do not have to lobby with the heads of the concerned national government agencies for specific allocations in their jurisdictions. And so efforts are continuing in determining the role of government in the economy, and two, instituting the proper division of labor or accountability between the national government and LGUs in the provision of public goods. At this point, there is no debating the point that national defense should be a national government activity, for example. No single LGU has an incentive to provide this service. Everybody benefits. Its government jurisdiction would rather free ride than provide it directly. And so the national government taxes and spends for an armed forces. By contrast, the debate goes on in the provision of a police force by LGUs. The benefits are largely local, which argues for a bigger role for LGUs in setting up a police force. However, to ensure uniform standards in the quality of a police force, the national government sets up standards and a training academy to ensure that all LGUs do not cut corners when they try to set up their own police force. Moreover, LGUs tend to differ in the initial endowment of resources. The national government may intervene with matching grants to lessen those LGUs so that standards are not compromised. Counterpart grants from the national government may range from 0 for first-class municipalities and 100% for fifth-class municipalities, as explained also earlier by our presenter. And a very critical aspect of decentralization, however, points to the budget constraint of both the national government and the local government units. The budget constraints of both are significantly affected by the Supreme Court decision, and I will pause at this point and give my comments on this later after the part 2 presentation of Dr. Jokno Sikat. Thank you. Hello? Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Canlas. We now proceed to the comments of Dr. Mendoza.
Thank you, Rosalie, and thank you very much, Justine, for that excellent presentation. I felt like I was actually catching up with my breath as well when I was just listening to you. But you covered quite a bit of ground, and I highly appreciate this. Just like Dr. Canlas, I want to congratulate you on a lot of the work that you've been doing in this area. You appear to be the emerging expert now in this particular area, and we look to you for these types of studies. My small contribution, which I did not write as eloquently as Dr. Canlas, so I will just sort of discuss them one by one, has to do more with the governance implications of some of what you mentioned. And I think these are the things that we sort of miss when we look at the macroeconomic or overall figures. And we probably need to think through some of the nuts and bolts eventually of getting this done properly. And as with many reforms, and then this is sort of an observation for all of us economists, no? We tend to stick to the overall sort of level of analysis, but sometimes we need to dig a little deeper to show the range of governance experiences and diverse governance outcomes that might take place. So I'm going to point out a few things. You mentioned, of course, some of the theory underpinning the decentralization, and also by default motivating the Mandanas decision. There is a transactions cost literature that is very extensive since the early work of Tibu and Oates, as you mentioned, and a lot of empirical work that has followed since, not just in the Philippines, but in other countries. And the crux of that theory, at least by Tibu, is that there is a competition among multiple jurisdictions in terms of providing public goods, right? So this is what we teach in Public Finance 101. But in reality, in the Philippines, this is not necessarily taking place, this competition of jurisdictions. And in fact, in some places, you might think that economic actors, our citizens, are held hostage. In fact, they are unable to actually leave jurisdictions or transfer to jurisdictions with better public goods provision, except, of course, if you mention the migration of young people from badly governed provinces to the urban areas to look for jobs or to go to school, no? And which is why our schools in Metro Manila are sort of very full. The schools in Baguio are very full. The schools in Cebu are very full. There is sort of an outward migration of young people. And you have this, as I understand from SecRC's early research, as one of the most effective poverty reduction strategies of the country to get out of a badly governed area. So I think this is this is a stark reality for us in the Philippines, that because of the lack of jobs and the lack of effectiveness in terms of attracting investments and generating that economic dynamism in different parts of the country, they are going to eventually hemorrhage their young people. They will leave, right? So I guess there is some of that happening, and maybe that is some form of competition. But it is still not, in my view, the type of competition across public goods provision that was envisioned by Tibu. There is a trade-off actually to decentralization, and we don't really say enough about it, which is the accountability and oversight, as well as policy coherence from that vertical relationship from the center. That is, of course, assuming that the center is also well governed. If it is also badly governed, then you will have sort of a coherence in incoherence. Essentially, you have a bad governance at the center and bad governance at the local level. There will not be an effective oversight mechanism. But in many jurisdictions, and in particular in this case, when we're talking about public finance management, I think we should give credit where credit is due, that the center has managed to somehow upgrade our institutions in public finance, in budgeting, in tax policy and tax reform. And these are the things that actually give us pause when we're thinking about giving more resources to local governments and decentralizing some of these functions, because we expect that there should be a catch up in their own PFM institutions as well. And if you just think that maybe we were able to resuscitate our credit ratings after 30 years of reform since the EDSA revolution, maybe that's the kind of timeline we're also looking at for the different provinces in terms of trying to upgrade their institutions in PFM. So I wanted to just sort of mention this. I also wanted to sort of touch on some of the tensions between central and local when we're starting to decentralize and devolve, right? And I think beyond the rules, the executive orders, the laws, and all that, there is the reality of what actually takes place, and it is not always reflecting what the rules sort of suggest, no? And in fact, there's a good deal of ambiguity. Talking to, for instance, folks like Chat Manasan about this particular sort of reality in our country, there is a tension, for instance, in social protection. For instance, it's supposed to be decentralized, but who targets who is a poor person and who gets the transfer, no? And there is a push and pull taking place because if you have a badly governed area, they're going to use that transfer for propagating political control and so on. There is also tension in crisis response, as we have seen in the last 2 years, when we saw in front of all of us, for all of us to see, central and local government pushing responsibilities at each other or grabbing responsibilities from each other. And this, I think, is the reality not just in the Philippines, but in other countries as well. If you look at the experience of the United States, for instance, the tension in terms of the mask mandates and what is the role of the states versus the central, and how you actually handle public good provision such as curbing the spread of COVID-19. The final thing I wanted to mention, which I wanted to acknowledge the excellent example you just raised, and I join you in your advocacy, Justine, on the schedule of market valuation. This is another excellent example of misaligned incentives, it seems, particularly for areas in the country where it's not just businesses, it's not just politically unpopular to actually upgrade the tax. It's actually the politicians that own a lot of the assets that will be taxed. So, talk about misaligned incentives. It's not surprising that they're not in a rush to actually increase the tax base, because they'll end up paying quite a big chunk out of it. So I think these are the realities that we have, and I think it's up to us and our creativity as reformists to figure out how to create the balance so that you have rules that are made not for the badly governed, but for both the well-governed and the badly governed. Because sometimes we end up making rules that are draconian because we do not want the badly governed to succeed, no? But then when you make those draconian rules, you also punish the well-governed who just want to demonstrate to us all those nice theories about Tibu and oaths and how being closer to local government can actually provide better public services and all that. So I think that's the tension that we are in right now. We create rules, and it's not just government, maybe even academic institutions. You create rules for those who are misbehaving, when in fact you should actually nuance them, carrots and sticks. Rules for the misbehaving, but also incentives for those who want to behave well and want to provide better service. So I think I will leave it here for now. I have some other ideas, but I'll take advantage of the second tranche. Thank you, Justine.
Thank you. Do I respond, or yeah, or perhaps later in the Q&A?
Later, perhaps, Justin. Yeah.
Yeah, we're over time.
Yes.
but very good points. Thank you both, Ron and Dr. Canlas.
Okay. Thank you so much. Sarah had just reminded us that we needed to take a photo of the group before, because I know that many of you will not be able to join us for the entire length. So if I could just ask that we do a quick photo op, so we have documentation of this proceedings. Okay, I will take photo and you also take photo, Sarah.
I will take a
Okay, well,
screenshot.
take a screenshot, yeah. Okay, so here we go. There are two, we have to do it twice. There are two gallery shots. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3.
From my end, 1, 2, 3. Another one, 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So we can now call on Justine again for part 2 of the presentation.
Yes. So thank you so much. I'll try to be as quick as I can. So this one, having established the, so that we're all aligned on the concepts that we'll be discussing in the second part, we'll now continue with the implications of the Mandanas Garcia Supreme Court ruling. Now, what is the Mandanas ruling? I mentioned this earlier. It ultimately broadened the national government revenue base on which to compute the annual intergovernmental fiscal transfers of LGUs, now known as NATA. And I mentioned this as well earlier. It's now expanded to include Bureau of Customs. Formerly, it was just on the BIR. Now, Executive Order number 138 offers guidelines on the full devolution of certain functions of the executive branch to local governments and the creation of the Committee on Devolution that would oversee the efforts of local government units and affected national government agencies. So this is the basic guiding principle behind the current efforts to implement the Mandanas ruling, even pre-implementation of the Mandanas ruling. And as Ron mentioned earlier, which is very valid, these are the rules, but then the implementation really has been challenging and will be moving forward. Now, the ComDev members have been developing capacity building programs guided by the DAP's LGU segmentation framework. So this would perhaps also address, which I agree with also, there being a sort of discriminatory policy in terms of the better performing and the lagging LGUs, especially in terms of governance. So the DAP has a framework that they will be implementing right now. They categorize the different local governments in terms of their measure of governance, and they plan to focus more of their efforts for the lagging ones using certain criteria. So this is trying to in some way discriminate, but of course, let's see how this pans out. Now, other laws such as the Seal of Good Local Governance and Community-Based Monitoring System Acts, which were implemented, which were passed back in 2019, also offer assistance to LGUs in capacity building, particularly for poor and disadvantaged LGUs. So later on, I will argue that all these efforts at the national government, we just have one national government, we should all be aligned in order to be able to, efficiently use public monies. We have very limited fiscal space, so we should use it wisely. Now, what are the budgetary implications of the Mandanas ruling, particularly for 2022? For the NATA, there was a 38% increase of about 263 billion pesos, totaling 959 billion NATA to all LGUs. So this represents just almost 20% of the national budget, the 5.024 trillion budget in 2022. Now, to recover fiscal space, the policymakers have actually proposed to reduce national government, local government support programs and prioritize poor LGUs. So there was evidence also of this in another discussion paper. The originally proposed one, so the budget, it's proposed first by the executive, right, and then it's submitted to Congress. The one originally submitted by the executive had a drastic reduction of about, if I'm not mistaken, almost 60%. But of course, when it left Congress, you know, some of the what was cut out for LGU support programs came back, but that's for another presentation. Now, by sector, the increases in the share of subsidy to LGUs were accommodated by decreases in the shares of education, social services, and by agrarian reform, natural resources, trade, industry, tourism, and communications, road, and transportation. So what I'm talking about here is when I looked at the shares of the different subsectors of the national budget, like where they spend at social service, economic services. So in economic services, all of the other sectors shrunk. In terms of share, the nominal could still increase, but in terms of shares, it shrunk to accommodate the increase in the subsidy to LGU. So here we see the share of NATA to national government expenditure since 2008. So it averages about 16, well, just about 16%. So here there's a spike in 2022 because of the implementation of the Mandanas Garcia Supreme Court ruling. Now the next slides are actually a summary of the key findings of some of our studies at PIDS, and we tried to organize them as best we could in terms of as recommendations. Now, how can LGUs be partners in national development? And this is through improved local governance. And Ron made a very valid point also. It's not just about the rules and the laws, it's really what's going on. He has a published article also on political dynasties, and I myself, my dissertation really was trying to understand what determines allocation of spending across local governments, and it's really it depends largely on what the priorities of the local government is. Now, how can this be improved? That's still a big question that I hope perhaps Ron and I can look at later on, work on later on. Now, there are 4 main points I'd like to suggest. Now, utilize funds strategically. Okay. Second, enhance revenue mobilization. Third, if national government assistance programs to LGUs will be continued, these must be clearly targeted. And there must also be a sunset clause, because I'm also of the mind that we have we have a lot of priorities right now, not just growing the economy, but also servicing our debt, which is still manageable. We also have a DP on that now. But that's also very important. We have to be strategic in our spending. And fourth, to implement institutional reforms and strengthen coordination and alignment for devolved goods and services that spill over boundaries. So this would also help, contribute to what Ron said earlier about accountability and oversight and integration. I'll discuss this more later on, but Professor Hall Rosalie also has a paper on local water sector and the challenges in that in terms of the regulatory and institutional framework. So how can we utilize funds strategically? First, through strengthened identification and prioritization of investment programs. So local governments have a development plan, just like the Philippines, and then they have, from this, they try to identify the gap between the vision and then where they are right now. And from this, they identify a list of interventions which they include in their investment program. So the investment program will help bridge that gap. But the investment program, of course, would require funding. So what we saw in our studies in 2018, only about 40% of municipalities, because we did a survey of all municipalities in the Philippines with regards to their development planning process as prescribed by the DILG. So only about 40%, but this has been updated because there were 2 department orders that, told LGUs to update their plan, otherwise there would be show cause orders. So there were a couple of these issued before the pandemic. So only 40% of municipalities had updated comprehensive development plans. So this is CDP, and 31% of these were valid. So the local development investment program, and only half of these prepared project briefs for these. So why is that a concern? Well, if you have a poorly prepared, proposed program, come the implementation time that year, you might not be able to implement it because, let's say, you want to build a road, but then you didn't do your you didn't do your homework. Apparently, you can't build a road there because the land is unstable or something like that. That represents an inefficiency in terms of time, especially. So that's why that was one of our findings that we wanted to highlight. Now, and this is actually where S&T can also help, in this development planning and investment program. Now, improve strategic fund utilization. We need to ensure that LGUs spend. So it's not enough that you have the plan. You have to spend on these investment programs. And as I mentioned earlier, evidence showed that municipalities in 2017 spent an average of only about 76% of mandated local development fund, which is required to be 20% of whatever LGUs receive every year from the national government in terms of the NATA, the Intergovernmental Fiscal Transfer. So this will be larger with Mandanas, although next year we'll expect it will shrink now, the transfers to them, because it's based on the third preceding fiscal year, and 2020 actually COVID-19 hit us, so revenues went down. But in any case, we found evidence, and this is the World Bank study also did, a bit more. They really went down to the local governments. They had the large team working on this. They found it was just about 56% of what was mandated, and this represents the opportunity cost of not implementing investment programs. If you don't spend what you're supposed to spend on, especially in terms of infrastructure, then you're lagging the development process. So in economics, for the benefit of those who are non-economists, so we suggest, there's this aggregate demand theory that suggests, actually it's more Keynesian policy that suggests that the government can actually help increase incomes, or at the national level, it's gross domestic product, but there's also the local level. They also have their own incomes now. They can increase it by spending. Okay, so if they spend on, let's say, infrastructure. Spending on infrastructure, they have to pay the contractor. The contractor will hire workers, and that will create income, that will employ people. They will buy supplies, that will also jumpstart the construction industry, and then that will create income. And those earning income from that will also spend in the economy and increase aggregate demand. That's the multiplier effect that I mentioned earlier. So that's what we want. You need to spend. Now, the local development fund will be the main source of infrastructure spending if national government, local government support programs are discontinued. Now, we did our homework also back in 2018. We tried to estimate how much was the fiscal gap for these municipalities that we surveyed. It's basically a census. We surveyed 1373 municipalities, except for those in Barnes. We focused on municipal roads, rural health units, and evacuation centers existing in 2017. LGUs have to take on this spending to fulfill that mandate. So this is 167 billion based on existing infrastructure in 2017. And if you recall the figures, kanina, it was about 256 billion that was given this year in addition. So okay, it's enough, but then local governments have more to spend than just this. So this is just a breakdown of that, and I can share the slides with you. So we in the interest of time now encouraged. Maybe the professor. Maybe I have to explain this first. Now, what we did was in 2017, we did an inventory of all the infrastructure in these areas of municipalities, and then based on their inventory, we tried to estimate the first, what the target was. So in this case of roads, what we did was we wanted them to pave 100%. How much would it cost for municipalities to pave all existing roads in 2017? So we had to look at the proportion of unpaved roads. So that was about 8,000 kilometers, which totaled about 133 billion pesos. So there are standards for costing for this. In the case of a municipal road for certain, specs, it's about 16 million, per kilometer. So it's the same thing for primary evacuation centers. We tried to estimate this, but we focused primarily on geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas. How many do not have a primary evacuation center? And then the cost is a range because it depends on what the locality needs. So this is also standard costing. You need a smaller evacuation center, a larger one, depending on the number of families you want to house. Same thing for rural health units. The target before of DOH was to have one rural health unit per 20,000 population. So that's how we estimated the fiscal gaps. Now, on the second general recommendation, encourage enhanced local revenue mobilization. And Ron and I have talked about this a bit earlier. Now, LGUs have long been dependent on the transfers, averaging about 66% of local government income in the past decade. So I mentioned this, I'm an advocate of the real property valuation bill. to provide additional funds in local service delivery. However, there is a disincentive, and Ron also mentioned this earlier in a different context, but there are always disincentives. There are trade-offs created by the increased income because of the Mandanas ruling. LGUs might continue to be lax in effort. Now, I also believe that we should engage in the private sector and civil society organizations, let's say through PPPs. This is the way to go if we have limited funds at the government level. Yeah, we should do this. Now, third, if national government, local government assistance programs are continued, these must be clearly targeted. It needs to be clearly targeted, meaning you need to know, like in any social protection program, you need to know who to target and how much and for how long. Okay, that's how the 4Ps is structured as well. Now, 2020 PID study showed that some NG programs, which are mandated to prioritize poor LGUs, showed weak, at best moderate, association between regional poverty incidence and expenditure allocations. Now, the 2022 Growth Equity Fund I mentioned earlier should be well targeted with clearly defined objectives. This is about 20 billion, but it was whittled down when it passed through Congress to about, I think, 5 billion, if I'm not mistaken, for this year. So we're going to be looking at this, monitoring how this is implemented this year. Now, to avoid duplicative efforts and spending, as I said earlier, we have to coordinate the efforts of all national government agencies, which is why perhaps the ComDev is very important as well. Now, what is the importance of collaboration, of NG-LGU collaboration? And Ron also touched a part of this earlier. In Section 2 of the Local Government Code, it says partners, LGU should be partners in national development. Now, what is the contribution of the LGU to the economy? As I mentioned earlier, it's about average of 4%. Now, how to improve collaboration or coordination across different levels of local governments, and also the vertical integration, which would be with higher levels of government. So the results of another of our commissioned studies by the DILG. So most of our studies are commissioned by the DILG at the PIDS. So the results of the PDP localization effort. What is the PDP localization effort? This one was an effort instituted in 2018, 2017. It was to align the Philippine Development Plan, which we have, with the provincial development plan. But the nice thing about our Philippine Development Plan is that with the late Secretary Paderanga, he introduced what you call the results matrix. The results matrix actually helps monitor key indicators, which includes also our commitments to, let's say, sustainable development goals and all that, and climate change. Per sector, there are indicators that are monitored, and then it's assigned to a certain branch of the national government. So they tried to do this. They did this at the provincial level, and it was well received by those at the province. Although, of course, it would entail, really capacity building, but they really received it well in order to align the efforts. Now, in the transition to the Mandanas, the EO 138 stated that, I'm sorry for this acronym now, DTP stands for the Devolution Transition Plan. So even before the implementation of the Mandanas, local government units and affected national government agencies were required to draft a devolution transition plan, and there are guidelines with regard to this. So our study this year at PIDS, also commissioned by the DILG, is really to look at this, the devolution transition plan. So it'll like be a baseline. So in the Mandanas, in the implementation of the Mandanas, this is time zero. Okay, what is the current situation in terms of the implementation of the devolved functions of LGU? So that's what we're going to do now. So it could be the basis, we need baseline in order to be able to monitor progress. That's what we're doing this year. Now, there's also a need for strategic fund utilization. So I won't dwell on too much on this, but this is actually another DP that we have, which looks at the planning and budgeting framework of local governments and how to align it with national objectives as well. I'm not saying that, local governments should do what the national government tells them or prioritize what they tell them. I'm just saying that the national government has many sectors and priorities, and it's important that local governments also figure out how they can contribute, or which particular sector, let's say if it's environment or agriculture, that they are a part of. So at least that the public efforts, public finance efforts are all aligned. We can discuss that another time. But I also believe, Ron mentioned earlier, and I'm also a strong advocate, there's a need for institutional reforms. There's a need for improved coordination and alignment in the delivery of goods and services that spill over boundaries, what we call externalities. So we published an article in the PJD that found that ambiguous and overlapping regulatory mandates of oversight bodies resulted in fragmented and at times duplicative local water supply interventions. So I cited Rosalie here for a couple of her papers, and she has some forthcoming as well. So that's one of the examples actually of the need to strengthen also oversight capacity. Now, addressing such overlaps and clearly assigned functions to the appropriate level of government is needed. And I think there's a need actually for more inter-LGU cooperations. There are some pockets like in that do have strong inter-LGU cooperation, because of course you have limited funds, and if this, let's say like flood control, if it affects LGUs that are contiguous to each other, then they should have a common effort in that. Now, PDP localization effort will help identify areas of priority that may spill over boundaries and benefit from coordinated strategic investments. So this is the other paper I mentioned earlier. Now, recent evidence has shown that the current criteria used to establish and create LGUs is insufficient to cover the LGC prescribed staffing complement. So this is a recent study I had with Dr. Vic Paqueo, and I think this is also very important. So this is part of the institutional reforms necessary, because if you take a look at the local government code, it states the income requirement for you to be able to establish a municipality is, if I remember correctly, it's still 2.5 million pesos in 1991 prices. And that is very, very outdated. It has not changed since 1991. Okay, so that is the requirement. If you want to become a municipality, you must have at least this much in terms of potential income. You have to show this. But what we did in this exercise in our discussion paper, we tried to estimate the human resource complement. How much would it cost to, the local government code also has mandated positions that must be filled for the bureaucracy. It has elected, mandated, and optional positions. And let's say for a first class municipality, what we found was that it costs about 40 million pesos for a municipality to fully, per year, to fully, hire all of the positions that are prescribed in the local government code. So clearly the requirement for you to become a municipality is not enough. But, in Congress, there have been, this has been a long-standing reform there, but it is never, taken flight. Now, moving forward as partners in national development, for improved and strategic fund utilization and revenue mobilization, there's a need to improve technical capacities of local officials for development planning and investment programming. When you talk to them, when we did our census, their heart, most of the planning officers that we spoke to and the engineers that we spoke to really had, their heart in their jobs and, tried to really do their best. But some of them actually are also bogged down because sometimes they also carry other hats, the planning officers, the engineer, and all that. So there's a need to really focus on that. And I think that the ILG is moving towards this. Now, to make an impact on local development outcomes, these must be implemented and monitored. Yes, you have to spend what you plan to spend on, and you have to spend on good, well thought out investments. Now, and of course, Dr. Canas would know a lot about this, being the former Secretary DG of TEDA. Now, you must spend as mandated, especially the local development fund, and there's a need for institutional reforms and partner with private sector. Now, for NG-LGU programs that are continued, this must be better designed, targeted, and time-bound. Now, I tried to include science and technology in this now, as requested by Giselle. And actually, I recently looked at I was in talks with the DOST. They're drafting what we call the medium-term expenditure framework, which is a PFM tool, public financial management tool, that tries to map out how much the DOST would need in terms of their programs. There was a question earlier I read, in terms of the programs for the next 5 years. And it is perceived to be a tool that would actually allow you to be able to be more, provide more justification whenever you go through the annual budget process. Now, this plays an important role. Research and development and their outputs, knowledge and technology could be perceived as public goods once provided without any patent. So what do I mean by that? Once you provide this knowledge and there's no, patent, let's say like in a medicine, you would have 25 years patent. The patent also actually is an incentive for you to invest in R&D, given by the government. But once it's common knowledge, so it's a public good. Everyone can take advantage of it. Or alternatively, research and development tries to address the market failure of incomplete information. Now, because of the large costs required to invest in science and technology, it might be better to take advantage of economies of scale and develop such at the higher levels of government. Even the DOST in our talks now, they were saying that um, they were being asked to draft, what could be devolved, but then the thing is, there is economies of scale, meaning, there are large investments required for research and development, and you all know this, you're scientists and engineers, so it's better that it be perhaps at the higher level of government or guided. Now, when I looked at the DSC programs, there were, they said there were challenges of sustainability of the laboratories and other institutions they built that serve as venues for S&T investments. But still, they're trying to strengthen their efforts in their regional institutions that they built. And I think this is the way to go. Perhaps not necessarily devolve S&T to the to the barangay. They might not have the capacity to do this, but perhaps a regional hub or up until the province. But I think a regional hub might be the better, proper venue because they might have more capacity. So thank you very much. These are the list of my references.
Thank you very much, Justin. That was very exciting. I was so busy trying to catch up and write as many notes as possible. I'm very excited. I'm part of a bigger project right now with colleagues from the Australian National University looking at urban politics. And one of the things that we are looking across for the 4 cases for me and my colleagues is infrastructure. So I'm very happy that you tackled a whole lot about this topic, and it will be very, very beneficial to us, particularly since we're very interested in the plight of key cities like Cebu and Iloilo, where I come from. Okay, so we now move on to the comments. Again, maybe we can reverse and start with Ron first, and then Dr. Canlas.
Thank you, Rosalie, and thank you, Justine, for that second part of your presentation. And I guess we get to the meat of today's meeting, which is you have some ideas on reforms that we could push. My small contribution is maybe to juxtapose your suggested sort of reform focus in my appreciation of political economy, of how we can actually change the dynamics of this environment, so that we have the better outcomes that we're actually trying to get at. I really like the idea of boosting science and technology, and living in Marikina, for instance, it just strikes me that everyone living near a river that always faces flood risk, we need to better understand how we manage these common goods more effectively, and how we pull all of that knowledge and all of that research so that it results in actual action. It's really a collective action challenge, the generation of the knowledge, and then the application of that knowledge in actual policy, and the actual changes in behavior that result in the better outcomes. I think if you boost science and technology, you eventually end up boosting a key democratic partner at the local level, which is the many researchers and academic institutions that actually in other countries, I've seen this really good study in the US. There are development boosting effects of being near academic institutions. And I don't think we have strengthened our academic institutions enough so that they may actually be partners in this, as Justine mentioned, how do we arrive at stronger development outcomes. So I think with other reforms that are trying to boost the education sector, we can think of the functions of the education sector, academic institutions, in governance, in advancing some of the better outcomes for decentralization. Now, I think there will be certain types of activities and cultural changes necessary. Some of us academics don't really like to engage in local governance. We like to stay in our so-called ivory tower and sort of do our work, teach quietly, and do our quiet research. But I think if we can become a democratic stakeholder in the broader sense, and certainly they can be allies in the different parts of the country, then advancing R&D is one aspect of it, and There could be many upsides to this, as Justine mentioned. I do think we need to think of matching grants so that we encourage them to pool resources and co-produce what will essentially become regional public goods that don't just create benefits for a province, but maybe for a group of provinces. So Justine mentioned the blue economy, for instance. Maybe those provinces with common challenges related to maritime management of natural resources, there could be an incentives grant created so that they can pool it and create the regional public good of the research and development for that particular area. The other thing, of course, I will suggest is we really need to boost impact evaluations in this country. And then I think PIDS is a champion of this. I know SecRC, SecBen, and others have been championing this already since the past. Because I think when you produce this knowledge, when you build it, they will come. This is essentially the assumption, that there will be young people, democratic stakeholders, better appreciating, the value of a better strategized and better implemented policy compared to something that is haphazard, right? And as long as we don't build that kind of knowledge, then we don't necessarily have a strong lobby boost, to actually use money more effectively, prioritize those with biggest social and economic impact, and so on and so forth. So I do like the idea of creating some sort of prioritization at the center, but I think prioritization should also take place at the local level through this change in culture and change in appreciation of impact, development impact of where we spend money. And here, I think we have a long way to go. Honestly, if you look at where many LGUs spend money, basketball courts, waiting sheds, those kinds of things, farm to market roads, these are quite palpable, and the citizens can see them immediately. And I guess there is a political upside to that kind of investment, no? But what about R&D on combating disease and better utilizing natural resources so that you don't exhaust them? You don't necessarily have an immediately palpable impact, and we need to develop the culture and maybe the next generation that appreciates better that kind of development outcome that is probably more important than any number of farm to market roads and basketball courts that you can produce. So I think that's part of what we need to do. My final suggestion is, and I really appreciate how Justine and her team did a lot of work on all those figures, but I do think we now need to start thinking about the local equivalent of what Justine just presented. All the disaggregated information at the provincial, maybe even further disaggregated level, to create the constituency for monitoring the performance, the allocations, and all of this. And I have to say that maybe greater transparency in the governance environment that we are in right now in the Philippines. This is what we need in order to create that culture, that behavioral change, that broader appreciation by our citizens of where we spend our money, how effectively we're spending our money, and how effectively, as Justine mentioned, we're advancing our development goals. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ron. Now we go to Dr. Canlas.
Thank you very much, Madam. I'm standing in the way of I'm the last man standing in the way of the Q&A, so I'll try to stay within the 5-minute time constraint given to me. I'll focus, therefore, on the economic implications of the Supreme Court favorable ruling on the Mandanas Garcia petition. And in this regard, I'll look at the budget constraints faced by each of the national government and the local government units. Okay, so the budget constraint may be described in terms of sources of funds and utilization of funds. And the SC decision changes each of these budget constraints. For the national government, the sources of funds are tax and non-tax revenues. These are all familiar to us. The biggest would be tax collections would be the personal income taxes, the corporate income tax, and then the value-added tax. For non-tax revenues, those who have traveled would know that they have to pay an amount for their passports, and then if you register your car. So those are the fees paid by clients who avail of the frontline services of some government agencies. And then when we look at the uses of those funds, they are for spending on government services, as well as mandatories. Call them mandatories because year in and year out, they will have to be paid, including debt servicing, the IRA of local government units, as well as social security payments. For local government units, the sources of funds are the local taxes plus the internal revenue allotment, while the uses will include spending for running the local government units from the municipality to the barangay all the way down to the lowest unit, and then the local development projects that each of the local government units will try to implement. The effect of the SC decision on NG's budget constraint is, as already mentioned by Dr. Justine, to reduce the national government share out of the internal tax collections while the share of LGU increases. So LGUs will see the sources of their funds increase as a result of the Supreme Court decision. So nobody likes an imbalance. So to restore balance following the implementation of the SC ruling, an option for national government is to reduce spending on services that properly belong to LGUs. This means a reapportionment of responsibilities between NG and LGU. I'll illustrate this first for public works and highways. It involves both national government spending as well as local government spending. This type of spending has large economic impacts through physical integration of the economy. Such integration leads to economic scale.
Turn that off. Oops.
Am I coming through?
Yes, yes, sir. Okay, sir.
Okay, such integration leads to economies of scale in the distribution of goods, which is growth enhancing. The division of responsibility on paper between NG and LGU is as follows. The Department of Public Works and Highways is responsible for all national roads. Specifically, those are the arterial road networks from north to south as well as east to west. The LGUs are responsible for local roads, the provincial and municipal road networks that connect to the arterial roads. Now, if the DPWH still budget for local roads, then this must stop following the Supreme Court ruling. Next, let me turn to another core value of Filipinos, the health, specifically public health services. Public health continues to be a spending priorities in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're not out of the woods yet, we know that. So basic health services are devolved, but research and development, the molecular laboratories, etc., they call for national government support. Moreover, inequality of resources among LGUs may force poor LGUs to cut corners and sacrifice even the minimum standards. So NG, the national government, must institute matching grant transfers to assist poor LGUs in basic health delivery. The details were already outlined by Dr. Justine, like rural health units, barangay health centers, etc. In education, another core value of Filipinos, school building is currently devolved. Science and technology, however, involves a lot of basic research and must be supported by NG. We know this from the usual argument that the positive spillover effects from research and development in science and technology, for example, are in abundance. And those who do the research are not really compensated for all the other spillover benefits. So there could be underinvestment in that. And so national government must step in to support it. As the national government adjusts to the SC ruling, LGUs must improve their capacity for development planning. These are the local development plans that Justine mentioned. LGUs must acquire skills in project evaluation and cost-benefit analysis to help them in prioritizing among an array of devolved development projects. In addition, LGUs must make use of their taxing authority for recurrent sources of revenues, keeping in mind as they do so the basic principles of vertical and horizontal equity to help address inequality issues. Lastly, on the part of the national government, adjusting the Supreme Court ruling entails cutting wasteful spending. And how do we illustrate this? Pork barrel allocations, such as the last name I saw for it was Countryside Development Funds, are notorious for having caused the commitment of plunder on the part of some legislators. This type of wasteful spending must stop. So if it's a wasteful government spending, why allow it? So this is one of the anomalous outcomes of devolution. It distorted the behavior of some legislators towards assuming executive functions instead of merely legislating. So these are some of the adjustments that the national government take, as well as some of the LGUs may have to undertake also some important political and institutional reforms. But these are not meant to be exhaustive, they are meant to be illustrative. And Dr. Justin Sikat and his group at PIDS, I'm sure, will continue looking at these particular concerns to be able to come up with a successful implementation of devolution or decentralization, and at the same time overcome successfully the challenges posed by the Supreme Court ruling on the Mandanas Garcia petition. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Canlas. Those are very insightful comments indeed. I'm sure the rest of our participants are very eager to ask questions. So we now proceed to the Q&A. But before that, we might spend a few minutes, Justin, responding to the issues they raised.
Yeah, very quickly. I agree with both of what they had to say, and I'd like to focus on the last one, that Dr. Canlas mentioned, the distorted behavior of lawmakers to become executive. And I agree. I think moving forward, and Ron also mentioned this, and this has always also often boggled me. How do you help improve governance, or really identify what's the matter, in terms of implementation? Like when we were looking at the local development funds implementation, that's one thing we really want to examine. Is it because of poor planning? That's how it's attributed. They're not able to implement their investment plans, or is it because the local chief executive does not want to do it? So that's again behavioral, that's governance. Or is it because of other regulatory measures in place? Like some would say it's procurement. The long procurement process and whatever would delay the implementation of projects. But then if you look at it, there are other LGUs that are able to implement their projects well. So how to look at that? So that this actually also refers to Ron's comment, which is very valid. No, but we also have to go down to the local level and examine some of these at the local level, some of these pressing issues at the local level. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin. So we now proceed to the Q&A, and already we have two hands. So first, we will get the question from Toby Diary, and then next is with Dr. Lansingan. Okay, Toby first.
Okay, thank you. And well, first of all, I'd like to thank Justin and our two very distinguished reactors, Dr. Canlas and Ron. I'd like to follow up the last points raised. Of course, the last election just showed that it's local families, many local families now control both national and local governments. You know, they're in Congress, they have their ano ba ito, mga party list, and then they're all executives of the certain local government. So how do we manage, you know, Mandana's ruling? Especially because actually in Pagtanaw, one of their first points that they make is ano eh, this should only work if there's governance. So governance actually on the top of the list of Pagtanaw. You know, you can plan all you want, but if governance is poor, how can we do that? So I guess that's the first part of the question. And then the second part is, are there best practices that we can adopt, you know, to move things forward? Because I think best practices would be good, and not just be critical all the time, but to identify best practices. Yeah, thank you very much.
Do I respond, Rosalie, or do we?
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
Okay, immediately. Yeah, thanks so much, Toby, for that question. Very difficult question, and I might tap you know, the former Secretary of NEDA and Ron to help me out in that answering. I just said earlier, it really boggles my mind. I've been researching on local governments for decades now, 2 decades, no, 3 decades, I think, already. Now, how do we manage governance? Well, I think that's where institutions or perhaps oversight plays a big role. One example earlier was that when we found that you know, the development plans weren't updated, they were outdated. We weren't able to look at the details of these plans, but they were outdated. So we presented the results to the ILG, and then afterwards, they issued already. You know, they always issue this, but this one there was a bit of a stick to it that will you will be issued a show cause order if you do not actually update your development plan and your investment programs. But having said that, it still goes beyond that. It's do they know, or how well equipped are they in updating this? So it's a really big you know, not really big challenge. There are many moving parts to this, and so I think institutions play a large part in terms of accountability. Now, best practices. Well, we do try to copy. I haven't really looked into this, but thank you for this idea. Maybe moving forward, I could, you know, try and already pattern. But the most of my studies lately really focused on setting the groundwork, looking at what is present now. So now I could perhaps, you know, move on to okay, how to move forward exactly, looking at best practices. So thank you for that, Toby. Ron, would you have anything to add?
Thank you.
Dr. Canlas. Dr. Canlas.
I don't know if this will answer the question of Dr. David, because yeah, it's a very lots of issues are involved in that particular question when you talk about local. Kasi, institutional, political, not to mention the legal and the technical. Let me just give one example where some coordination is being made. I don't know what's happening with it right now, but when I was at NEDA during the time of President Ramos, there was an effort to strengthen what we called what I think they're still called this way, regional development councils.
Yes, it's definitely.
And there's a trilateral representation there. There's government, but what was envisioned by President Ramos was the local government executives will be voting members, but legislators may participate as observers, not voting members, because he said coordination of development projects, for example, is purely an executive function. And then there will be some representatives from the private sector, in civil society and the private sector. Some RDCs were very successful in terms of coordination, particularly on development projects that, as you call it, there are spillovers across the jurisdictions. Let's say in Region 4, there's a very successful RDC because the members, particularly the members the conflict between, at the time, the local government executives and the legislators, there was no friction. So they were not competing for, I will have to implement projects coming from the legislators. So it was left to the heads of the local government to do that. But not in other RDCs. I know one in Central Luzon where the congressman and the governors did not see eye to eye. And so it was very difficult to implement development projects. So let me put it this way, RDCs are a mixed bag, but there are good ones there, and to the extent that there would be an sharing of experiences how they succeed, I think that would be a good idea to begin with, if the RDCs are still around, because I don't know really what powers they have at this point. I knew about it then because the NEDA served as secretariat to the RDCs. So NEDA was helping them monitor development projects, things like those, together with the budget. The DDM was there also to monitor the cash releases and accomplishments. So, NEDA was the physical accomplishment. So we had some good RDCs at the time. So I don't know with the others now. So that might be a possibility. Can I just add at the national level one possible adjustment I mentioned? Maybe one approach. I think the national government is worried about a possible fiscal crisis if you implement it all in one sweep, right? They might not be able to avoid it because it's not easy to give to the LGUs what they should be doing immediately. So if there's gradualism in the following sense, the cash transfers from NG to LGUs can be phased so that as an amount is transferred, it will have to be accompanied by a service commensurate to the amount transferred. And it's a service that properly belongs to the LGC. So I don't know how long it will take, the phase transfer. So, but if you give it all to them, I don't know how, as you mentioned already that these are difficult times, economically speaking, from a budgetary standpoint because of the large deficit as well as the large public debt. And with rising interest rates, that debt servicing will also be rising. So I think short of declaring a fiscal crisis so that the NG can avoid that big cash transfer immediately, maybe some phased
implementation
gradualism might be helpful. I don't know. I don't know if the law will allow it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Ron, do you have any further comment?
Thank you to Prof. Toby, who is my chemistry professor in college. I'm good at chemistry because of Prof. Toby. I think honestly, we're maybe a generation away from, a citizenry that really will not elect dynasties and will elect based on pure meritocracy. We need to keep working on the young people. Basically, this is an education and culture change challenge. And while we like to stay in the policy arena and sort of talk about how we're going to deal with the now, I think we should also recognize that there are many infirmities in our democracy that we need to address with the young. And we need to start investing in that if we will see one day a change in that culture. And many of the behaviors that we see right now actually make a lot of sense for citizens, because they don't see much coherence. They don't understand the value of different allocations. There's not so much a disaggregation of the data. So there's not yet that constituency, that strong constituency for better governance. And then you have many of our people who are subject to crises, to shocks, to the pandemic. And so they go back to the patron, the local patron-client relationship that many political scientists study. But I do think that based on some of the ideas outlined by Dr. Canlas and Prof. Justine just this morning, we can begin to change that culture. But make no mistake that the present citizenry we face right now will probably supply us even more dynasties in the next elections. And so the question now in my mind is, and I raised this with NEDA colleagues very frankly a few years back, how do we design policies knowing that governance is nowhere near where we want it to be? So you cannot assume governance to be fixed. So design your policies so that governance is, yun na nga, dynastic siya eh. So what do you do if the governance is dynastic? This is where folks like Justine and the creative sort of policies, matching grants, carrots and sticks, increased transparency, talk about constituency building, rewarding the well-performing, maybe even ranking them. These are the things that might begin to work in the immediate sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Ron. And so we go to Dr. Lansingan first, and maybe what we can do is to gather the questions in the interest of time as we're pushing to 10 o'clock. So we'll get the question from Dr. Lansingan, and then Mario, and then Ma'am Giselle, and then we'll give the floor to Justin. Hopefully that will work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosalie. This is Ino Lansigan from UP Los Baños. Thank you, Justin, for your excellent and informative presentation. As you know, effective governance, local governance would require LGUs to prepare a number of plans, about 20 of them, CLUP, LCCAP, the RRM, Solid Waste Water Management Plan, etc. And these plans are updated. Okay, need to be updated every now and then, about 5 or 6 years. But then this will also be a basis for science-based or data-based decision-making. And I think that this could be a strategy, perhaps an opportunity for the scientific community to enjoin the LGUs to probably invest on developing the platform at the LGU level for the needed environmental data, the needed socioeconomic data for scientific decision making. So what do you think would be, in your experience, would be a good strategy on how we can entice the LUUs to give some allocations for science-based decision making? Thank you.
That's a very good question, Dr. Lansingan. Okay, Mario.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah. My question is about education. I was alarmed by what Justine mentioned was the reduction in the national expenditure for education because of this, Mandanas ruling, and one of the national budgets affected is for education. So I wonder what the reasoning behind this. Of course, probably it's easier to reduce, budget in education than other, areas. But then, are we assured that some of the budget that will be devolved into the local governments will be used for education? So I was really alarmed by that, and if. But at the same time, I was tickled with the idea that, oh wow, perhaps the local governments, the communities will have more inputs into education. What are we're not sure of that, right? So it's really alarming for me. So, and I just want to throw it in the open. Thanks.
Thank you, Mario. Ma'am Giselle?
Thanks. I have the same concerns as Ino and Mario, and I'll just add a few more. Is there opportunity for PPPs for the private sector to be incentivized through the Mandanas? Second, regarding political dynasties, I think this will interest Ron. You have some model provinces where the congressman is now a mayor, or a former governor is now a mayor. I'm referring to Bataan and Iligan, the Iligan area. And they seem to be moving forward, especially Bataan. So that would provide a continuity between local and national, governance. Third, is there a plan for governance and civil service training at the national and regional level. So important. We have the DAP, we have the NCPAG of UP, and we have a private sector Institute of Solidarity for Asia that had trained Governor Abet Garcia and Governor Robredo, Jesse Robredo and Lenny Robredo in governance, of their locality. So there are many things that we need to talk about. This is at the heart of the problem of our country. I would also like to suggest that Cluster 13 host a study group face to face, or even a meeting like this on a regular basis, and try to come up with contributions of S&T. I mean, there's just so many other things that we need to talk about. I mean, I have so many other comments and ideas that could help, say, PIDS, the NEDA, and the other departments that would have to play a very critical role in the implementation of Mandanas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll go straight in the interest of time, Rosa. Thank you very much for those very important questions. So thank you very much for that question. How can S&T contribute to, to making the plans fact-based? Actually, I failed to mention, it's in one of our earlier discussion papers now, that we looked at the DILG prescribed guidelines, and they do in fact have their what you call the RAPIDS or the LDIS. So it's a local development indicator system that actually provides the information on which the local government will draft their socioeconomic profile, as they would call it. And that is what is used to actually sort of paint the current status of that local government, and as basis for designing programs and interventions so that they could bridge the gap to their vision. Now there's what you call, I mentioned this earlier, the Community-Based Monitoring Systems Act that was passed in 2019. So this is the focus is really more on poverty. It's really like a registry, so you can be able to identify. This was used by a lot of LGUs during the distribution of the SAP. So this also is a very also important area where perhaps S&T could figure in. But then this leads me to the second question of what is the strategy for moving this forward. And it still boils down to the governance. You were asking how can you ensure that there's a budget for this. For the poorer LGUs, they can possibly go to DILG because, as I mentioned earlier, that's in the law that they will prioritize the capacity building for, let's say, the development of the CBMS and all this, because this, of course, entails money. There are some exceptional, like let's say the municipality of Comona, they really have to allocate part of their budget, but for the poorer they could go there. But it really depends on the local chief executive how to push forward. Now perhaps at the national level, let's say in terms of oversight, this could be, it's a law, so perhaps there could be more guidance or capacity building how to implement this. Now for Mario's question, thank you so much for that question, and I'm sorry if my message was not really clearly stated. That was actually from another discussion paper of mine that looked at the proposed president's budget for the 2022. It was the share of education services. So the social services, there's education, social welfare, health, housing and community development, and then labor. So those are the shares within the social services that the national government spends on. Now, what I mentioned was just the shares. I really more look at the distribution. I do look at the nominal, yes, of course, but it makes more sense for me to see the stronger priorities in terms of the sectors when I look at the distribution across that subsector. So it was the share of education. It still had the highest, and by far very, very high compared to all of the other subsectors in the social services. But it's just its share that shrunk a bit, and the only other subsector in that social services that upticked was the subsidy to LGUs. So that's for that. My messaging perhaps was not as clear. Perhaps it was, but I can share the DP with you, and it explains it that way. Now, for Giselle, the opportunity for PPPs to be initiated in the Mandanas ruling. Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, I'm an advocate for PPPs. But again, as with my response to how can you make sure that you invest in data, it's really the local governments, the local chief executive who will initiate this. and if they're forward looking to really engage in PPPs, because of course you also need the capacity to do that. I know that some LGUs go to the PPP center to help them evaluate the establishment of, let's say, a water district. So that's there are ways to do this, but it really has to be the initiative as well. And that's the thing with local autonomy. You're given the authority to spend and prioritize what you want, and we try to have to work within that. And Ron mentioned something earlier. You have to find the policies that you're working within. Poor governance in economics, we call this, that's a second best. So this is a second best world. How do we, and I agree with him 100% on this, and I'm sure Dr. Canas has a lot of experience on working within the second best world and implementing policy. For the training, civil society, I think, yeah, I do know the NCPAG and the others. There's also DAP, and then there's the LGA also. But really, the DILG now is focusing on capacity building, and I'm sure they're tapping. I don't know for certain, but my impression is that they would also tap civil society for this, or at least individual participants from the civil society also with this. Now, for model provinces and governance and dynasties, I'll leave this to Ron. Thank you. He has more experience on these studies. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin, and for those interesting questions. Yes, may I just read the comments that are in the chat box from Joel, who had to leave early, who also expressed concern over what it feels like maybe the DOST and DA budgets would also suffer as a result of the implementation of the Mandanas Garcia ruling. So what's your take on that, Justin? Would that also mean, you mentioned about economies of scale, and perhaps that some of the more kind of basic research and development will have to remain at the national government level. So Joel expressed concern that does this translate to a shrinkage of the R&D budget, at least for the DOST?
As far as I know, my talks with the DOST, they were asked to identify what could be devolved to local governments. But as I mentioned also earlier, they're not too keen on that, especially because Dr. Khan has also discussed this. It's really economies of scale. And when I looked at their medium-term expenditure framework, it doesn't seem to be the case. That's why they want the plan is to strengthen. They already have established regional institutions, and Ron mentioned tapping higher education institutions as well. They have established some regional hubs, and they have identified some successful areas, and they want to replicate that perhaps in other regions, or in other we have big regions sometimes, so in other provinces, across provinces within a region. So there are efforts towards that direction, and I think, but me personally, I still think as of now, while we're still transitioning, so we're given 2 years to transition fully, okay, until 2024. So while we're still transitioning, this also addresses the phased implementation that Dr. Canas mentioned earlier. We cannot withhold the amount by law. Madedemanda yung national government. That cannot be withheld, the amount, the transfers, because that's legally theirs. But the phasing of the redevolution of certain functions is being done right now, and it could possibly be extended until we're really able to do that. Like in the case of BARM, right? They had a certain number of years to do it, but now they ask for an extension for the implementation of BARM. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Ron, do you have additional comments?
No. I just have all good words to share about Kong Joet in Bataan. And it's actually good to see that some of them, particularly the younger leaders, are thinking a little differently. And I think that's part of the governance transition. We're also supposed to encourage and support. The challenge seems to be that if you have the concentration of power and that power is used for reform, then they move fast. But the problem is if they do not use it for reform, then they get left behind even more. So I think that's the conundrum.
Thank you, Ron. Mom Giselle's hand is still up. Do you have other comments, questions, Mom Giselle?
I'm sorry. Well, I was typing. I just wanted to point out also investment in cyber structure. How would that be addressed? I like the Secretary Dante's comment on, well, aligning the road networks, the development on the local level, and then with arterial roads. Well, that would be connecting the municipal roads, say, with well, as a part of the road network for the whole province and region. Then I think that the most important investment, aside from infrastructure and cyberstructure, would be on suprastructure, which is really the advocacy of UP, well, during our time in Quezon Hall, but also now in PAASE. And that is competencies, skills, and expertise in various areas of development: agriculture, maritime, fisheries, health, disease, environment, mining, etc. And it doesn't have to be all at the PhD or the highest technical level, because we know many of the S&T workers that would drive the development of industries would be at the competencies and skills level. So they may not even have to be masters. So we have broadened our scope for developing the suprastructure or the S&T human capital of the country. I think that's critical. We can do all we want, but if we don't have the warm bodies to do this at the regions, at the LGU level, then the Mandanas ruling funds may not be put to good use. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I wish we could form study group hosted by the UPD School of Economics or even Ateneo. And then we could input into what Justin is doing, because I think the IRR of the Mandanas is very, very important. And you're right, we have to discretize, we have to categorize across regions, that depending on the development of the level of development of the region, also depending on the natural boundaries for the natural environment of the region. Is it coastal? Is it inland? Is it highland? Is it lowland? Things like this, I think, should be considered when you do the monitoring and evaluation and the incentives as well. That's so important. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. I'll just go straight ahead as well, Rosalie. And I agree absolutely with you. I was at the World Bank launch of the Philippine Economic Update Report, and really the way to go was digitalization. Even at the Philippine Economic Society, our conference last year was themed this digitalization, harnessing digitalization towards a transformed Philippines. And I agree with you absolutely in terms of the cyber structure, aside from infrastructure. But I think also this perhaps, of course, this will trickle down, but I think it's the national government still that should be on top of this, because this has a large economies of scale as well. And I don't presume to know about this particular issue, but from what I know from my colleagues also at PIDS and what I've heard, it's really, you have the institutions, you have to address data privacy, and then you have the establishing the physical infrastructure, and then you have to be sure that you can put towers in the local governments. So it's a whole, there are a lot of moving parts for this particular issue. But I agree with you. The national budget also, for the benefit of those, there's what you call the convergence program. It's called the MITI program. The medium, what's this? It's a ICT related convergence program. It's not really a convergence program in sense, but it groups all of the spending on digitalization, all of the efforts of the national government agencies, and accounts for it. So it tries to account for it. So that I think that should also be adopted, so we could really track what's being spent. And on your monitoring and evaluation, I agree with that as well. That's the purpose of our previous study for the ILG, and which we call the baseline study on fiscal and governance gaps. That was the 2021. The one we have for this year is also the baseline for the Mandanas implementation. So we're going to be assessing all of the devolution transition plans and grouping it together so that it could be used as a baseline for monitoring in the future. Now, finally, on the development of human capital and S&T and innovation, I absolutely agree. Actually, the DOST, if I understood the program correctly, they have this, scholarships where they require the graduates to actually serve still in their localities or in certain areas. Parang yung sa doctors, the equivalent would be the doctors to barrios or something like that. But they have this for S&T, and these are the ones that they tap to to thrive or to further develop the hubs that I mentioned earlier that they were talking about, the cities. So as you know, to really be able to use the talent that was developed there. But then the DOSC said they also have to have, you know, jobs available, which leads to migration. But that's another thing. That's Ron and Dr. Canas is a labor economist as well. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. Okay, I'm just going through the chat right now and seeing if there are other questions listed here. Okay, there's a comment from Dr. Sobade on local government and national government partnership and collaboration in S&T projects, so as to solve local needs like agriculture. So for instance, UP Visayas, our flagship program is fisheries. So I can totally relate to what Ron was saying a while ago about maybe you know, provinces and localities that derive a lot of their incomes from fisheries and aquaculture production to consider, you know, pooling development plans on how to develop their maritime resources. That certainly is true for, you know, parts of, for instance, of Panay, with a hardly very reliant fishing from the Visayan Sea. So there had been prior collaboration in that area for marine protection, for instance, conservation along those lines. And I think that it's a slight push is needed with respect to investments along those lines as well. So I see another hand. Then maybe Rodel.
Yeah, just a follow-up. These are being done already, but I think more needs to be done so that the lack of capacity of the local governments could be upgraded, you know, with their increased budget and with availability of expertise through the academe and the national agencies like the OST and PAASE. Then there can be collaboration so that the local needs can be met by SNT. And that right there, straight in the field, we can find solutions, science-based solutions, path breaking if necessary. And so we can now avail the increased budget of the local government, capacitate them. Maybe some of their people be sent to UP Ateneo or other university for their masters. Their projects will be on their local problems. And, you know, we have the experience under the leadership of Governor Nava of Guimaras, 2008 to 2012. He tried to implement the science-based governance. Our team leader was Dr. Lem Aragones from ISAM UP Diliman. And the scientists provided the advice. No? They really allocated the budget so that there can be data collection. And these were bases for really making the policies and projects science-based. So one concrete example is based from the study of geologist Dr. Siringan. They implemented the cheaper, I forgot how you called it, yung may poste, no? That will accommodate the influx of waves of the sea. And it will be less costly, but at the same time, it mitigates the cracks and the damage on the port, no? The local jetty port that could be made. So we have there capacitating the local government, and now with the increased budget from the Mandanas ruling, then it will now enable these local governments to really maximize the benefit, no, through these collaborations and partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe if Mom Giselle would like to give a few words. Justin did say that she has to leave by 10:30 and we need to wrap up very soon. Mom Giselle?
Me again. I'm sorry, I wrote in the chat box that there are fundamental sciences and technologies that affect landed cost productivity and competitiveness of regions, such as energy source development. So the mainstream energy source, natural gas sources and alternative sources, nitrogen ammonia production capability for fertilizer and fine chemicals production. So this is like, this could be region-based modular. And then you would also have, manufacturing, steel manufacturing for equipment, machinery that are needed in the provinces for developing agricultural and the fisheries industries, things like this. And then also, I am aware to a highlight this point. During the Pinoy administration, farmers' cooperatives and SUCs received tens of millions worth of equipment from the national government, but they were not put to good use and they were wasted because farmers and SUC staff did not know how to use them. So there's obviously a dire lack of S&T competencies and skills in the country. So I think I will end there, and I really wish this discussion will continue with a study group that could be hosted by the UPD School of Economics or the Ateneo School of Governance. Thank you. Economics and governance.
Thank you, Ma'am Giselle. Maybe last few words from Justin before we close the session.
I think I've said a lot of words already. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and I'd like to thank my, my esteemed colleagues also, Ron and Dr. Canlas, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share this. I do hope that, Ron, we get to work on something together later on. So thank you so much. And I also will be taking advantage of being a member of the PAASE as well if I need inputs for my studies in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin. I would like to thank Justin and Ron, Dr. Canlas, and all of you who have participated in today's webinar. On behalf of Sarah, my co-chair, who unfortunately has another appointment and had to leave early, I'd like to thank you all and for joining us quite early for many of us, but thank you for your great comments and interest on this topic. And we hope that there will be more of these PAASE events sponsored by Rec 13 in the future. We definitely will plan on doing so because the topic is just very interesting and timely. Okay, good morning to all and thank you.
Thank you. Good night to the rest. Yeah, thanks so
Our
much.
colleagues in the US.
Yeah, bye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.